Hi Ian, we're going to look today at how entertainment developed in 1920s America. And it developed in quite a few different ways, and it's quite tricky sometimes to get a full idea of all the different ways that it developed. So some of the ways were music, sport, cinema, and women. Now, music-wise, you had things like jazz, creating new stars like Louis Armstrong, who started to produce new types of jazz music, all over the country, became very popular. The creation of the radio meant that people had more of an opportunity to listen to these kinds of things, which was really good for people. Louis Armstrong was also an African American, so that did something for the perception of African Americans at the time. Started to kind of work towards racism. Didn't have a massive effect on it, but it still did something at the time. Now, sport-wise, you had things like boxing and baseball becoming very popular pastimes in the 1920s. Again, linked to the idea of radio, because you had matches that were like broadcast over radio. You had people commenting it, on those kind of matches. You had people like Jack Dempsey, who was a famous boxer. You had Babe Ruth, who was a famous baseball player. This idea of like Louis Armstrong, Jack Dempsey, Babe Ruth, it's kind of creating that idea of the celebrity. And it's the first time that the celebrity is kind of seen in the world really this time, because people didn't really have that, much knowledge about, who sang what song, who played for what team, who was in what film. This was the time where people started to get the real star power going on. You had in cinema, you had people like Ginger Rogers, like the idea of the film star at the time. And she, again, linked to the idea of women at the time. In the 1920s, you saw a new independence for women that had never really been seen before, creating a new, so you could say, class of women called flappers. I'm going to move over to this piece of paper while I explain what flappers were. Now, flappers, they were women who had basically found jazz and started to kind of listen to jazz quite a lot. And because of jazz being a little bit more rhythmic, and being a bit more faster paced, you had them starting to invent dances to it. You also had them start to kind of develop the fashion sense around that. So you had dancing that wasn't really seen as classical anymore. And some people saw the dancing that jazz music brought as a little bit rude. You also had them dressing differently. They had shorter skirts. And they also began to wear makeup for one of the first times, which was like unseen, before. You also had them going out and drinking and smoking. Now, before this, women weren't really allowed to do any of these things, but jazz music coming along kind of gave them a little bit more independence, because suddenly they could go out, they could listen to jazz, they could go out with their friends or with the boyfriends, with the husbands, and they could, start to have this experience that was completely centered around jazz. But because of that, flappers and women got more independence. So it had a big effect on America at the time. So if you just want to recap that there with entertainment, you had music, sport, cinema, and women. All of these things saw developments in the 1920s. And if you look over it, they all link quite well together. Music links to women, sport links to celebrity, cinema links to celebrity, and all together it links to the idea that Americans had a much bigger opportunity to find entertainment for a lot less trouble at the time, mostly because of the radio and because of increased wages, meaning they could afford to pay for all of these things. But that's just the once over. There's obviously a bit more detail in there, but if you are struggling with anything, feel free to ask. But this is just a nice general overview of entertainment in the 1920s.